Hello, I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer, and today I'm in my studio. This video is another of the series that, sort of ad hoc series that I'm doing over the next, I suppose, 18 months or so, not quite sure, about Britain at war. 80 years ago, Britain was at war with Germany, and there was a period that is fascinating to me, and I'm no expert by any means of the imagination. I'm just keen to learn and share really what I'm learning. So there's going to be people out there who know a lot more about this than I do, but if I can in some way encourage and inspire other people to find out more, then that's great. And the period is the Battle of Britain, which fascinates me. And the reason it fascinates me is because for the very first time since the Norman invasion, the civilians were under direct attack from an enemy in the land that they lived here in Britain. I've been reading this amazing book here called Dowding and the Battle of Britain, and it's a fascinating insight to the man, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, who was really, he's now become a bit of a hero of mine, who is really responsible for saving our island from invasion and the tyranny of Nazi Germany coming in 1940. But 80 years ago was 1939, and there was a sense that war was likely to happen. Hitler was in power and the fascist regime was rolling at an alarming rate. And while there were many of the elites who, for reasons I don't fully understand, were sympathising with what Hitler was trying to do, they were scared of communism. It started to become apparent that actually his methods and his ideology was extreme, and Europe was, going to be under his tyranny. So one of the things that the philosophy in terms of defence of the country was actually to make out that you were able to bomb your opponents. Air warfare had really come into some sort of fruition in the First World War. There were Zeppelins, and I mentioned this in my Prepare for War video I made recently. There were Zeppelins that had come over from Germany and caused a bit of havoc. I've since worked out that actually there were, as a result of those Zeppelins, there were 835 British casualties, civilians who died as a result of that, and 1,990 wounded. So no small figure, but not a massive, nothing like the carpet bombing that was later to come in the Blitz. But the theory was that the bomber would always get through. No matter what you tried to do, the bomber would always get through. So what you had to do was to have bigger bombers, bigger bombs, and have that as a threat, so that you would say, well, if you come and bomb us, we'll bomb you. Defence itself was not really terribly sexy. It wasn't really thought that we would be able to stop them. And in fact, Stanley Baldwin, the then Prime Minister in 1932, had said that the bomber will always get through. He made that speech in the House of Commons. Well, up comes this gentleman, my new hero, if you like, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, and I think he was given the Sir later on. He was a chap who was a pilot. He had fought in the First World War. He had experience of dealing with aeroplanes, and he was a very thoughtful gentleman who had worked out and had strategies that would be useful. Anyway, through the ranks, it's an interesting life story just in its own, but through the ranks, he came up and was promoted and took over, effectively, RAF Fighter Command in 1936 at its formation. And so he was really the chap who was responsible for thinking about what fighters were doing. He was actually relegated to fighter command because the bombers were the ones that was thought were going to be the heroes that people would talk about. A bit like in football, where the strikers, the ones that scores the goals, are the ones that you talk about. The defenders, it's like, they're just there to stop the balls going in the goal, but the strikers would be the sexy thing. And of course, we now think about those RAF fighter pilots who defended our nation as being the ones that are the heroes, if you like, as well as, of course, all the support mechanism and people that went to assist them. But it's interesting how it was a different thought back then. Dowding himself had been the first pilot to send a message by radio from an aeroplane while flying to the ground many years before the Second World War. And at the time, this new innovation of being able to talk to a pilot was not really interested or by the powers that be. No one was interested, but Dowding had kept that up, thinking this would be a very useful piece of technology in the years to come. He was very opinionated. He was difficult sometimes, or seemed to be difficult to work with in his younger days, and he was given this nickname Stuffy, which stayed with him all his life. And yet actually he was very thoughtful, he was very modest. He kept a lot of his thoughts to himself and his opinions for himself, and he had a very big passion about serving his country and doing it the right way. He understood flying and what was needed, and he was very interested in all the new scientific ideas. He wasn't somebody who didn't want to stay in the old school. He was very much for change. And so as people were discovering this new technical, as the science boffins were working out what RDF was, radio direction finding, that you could send a radio signal out and it would bounce back and pinpoint the point where it bounced back, be that a body like an aeroplane in the sky. And as a result, as it was clear that there may well be a war, defence was his baby. He realised more than anything else, defending the nation was going to be much more important, stopping the Germans coming in. If we could stop the Germans coming in, we then had a chance to win this war, but we needed to stop this massive invasion first. And he built, not personally of course, but he instructed to be built something called Chain Home, which was this series of what we now call radar towers to be built all down the never eat shredded wheat, the east coast and then the south coast. So if enemy approaching, they would be found, and it would be a small blip on a very primitive cathode ray tube, an old-fashioned television. Now this system wasn't very reliable. It couldn't pinpoint complete accuracy. You couldn't say how many aeroplanes were likely to be there. You could get a vague idea and a vague idea of height. But what it did tell you is there was a body of something coming. And through innovation, he could determine that it wasn't British planes, that they were German planes. And so it became a very useful thing. The Germans at this point didn't really know about this, or had no concept that it was going to work. The great thing about having the radar, he had realised, is you don't need a standing patrol going up and down the coast, constantly looking out for any aeroplanes coming in. You could see where they were, and you would be able to send your fighters where you needed them and direct them from the ground using radio. All this technology that he had determined was going to be absolutely vital in any battle that was going to happen. The government at the time hadn't really thought that fighters were going to be necessary. It was back to this bombing thing. Excuse me as I look at my notes, by the way. But Germany had been building bombers at an alarming rate since 1935. And Baldwin, the Prime Minister at that point, started to realise that it didn't look too good if actually what we had to do was go and bomb people. It didn't look, if we were bombing civilians, that didn't look very helpful, or didn't, make him look in good standing, killing innocent people for whatever reason. And he started to become interested, as Dowding had been influencing, I suppose, that fighters were cheaper than making bombers. A fighter could cost anything from between £5,000 and £10,000, needed less fuel, needed shorter runways, didn't need as big hangars, whereas a bomber would cost something like £50,000 back then, needed bigger hangars and more substantial runways and so on, and a lot more fuel. The government had the idea that, I've said that the bombers would be the ones, and so Dowding had been relegated to this fighter system, but that wasn't. This turned out to be the most important thing. So you might ask, well, what was revolutionary about what Dowding did? Well, he laid the groundwork really for fighter command and how fighting would be not only in the Battle of Britain, but later on in places like Malta. He backed radar, he backed the radio direction finding. He also laid down specifications for new fighters. At the time, we only had biplanes, very old-fashioned planes that had been around in the First World War. Germany had been developing new things, and it was clear that we had to have the state-of-the-art. So he decided that we needed monoplanes that were the fastest you could possibly go. There was the Schneider Trophy, which was encouraging all sorts of people around the world to have land speed records and things. And he commissioned 2 companies to come up with aeroplanes. And of course, we have the Hurricane and the Spitfire. Spitfire being all metal, single monoplane. He instigated that there were 8 guns fitted to it than the 2 guns that the old biplanes had, so that they would be as top as possible. And when it came back, they said, well, in the past, we've always had open cockpits. He wanted an enclosed cockpit so that the pilots were safe. And people were sort of saying, yeah, but, if you've got an open cockpit, you can look around and this, that and the other. If it's closed, it's not so good. He instigated that there were mirrors so that the pilots could see behind. But the most important thing he said was that if the Chicago gangsters could have bulletproof glass in their cars, why can't my fighter pilots have bulletproof glass in their planes, obviously to protect them, and other areas within the plane that he could have steel or whatever to stop bullets getting to his pilots as much as is possible. So he was instigating all of this, which was sort of going against the grain what everybody else was thinking, because they just didn't realise how important fighter pilots were going to be, and how important fighters themselves, these 2 different types, the Hurricane and the Spitfire, were going to be. It's absolutely amazing. He encouraged Rolls-Royce to develop the Merlin engine, which became what we know in the Spitfire, of course. He also equipped these planes with high-frequency wireless sets so that they could be produced. He saw the need for the ground plotting and operations room, and so that the radar and the observer corps could bring all this information back to central points, so he could then have those points looking at the map and work out where the pilots would need to be. With his different groups, which he'd split the country into 11 group and 10 group, 12 group, 13 group, so that he could dispatch fighters at the point of need, so that they would use as less fuel as possible and make as much damage as was possible. So he did all of that. So it was it's an incredible legacy of what he had set up in advance for what was at that point looking likely, but not necessarily guaranteed, because at any time the government may have capitulated and signed a pact with Hitler. In another video down the line, I want to talk about more about what Hugh Dowding did, and also some of the problems that he encountered, because all the way he is the man credited for the Battle of Britain, so winning basically the Battle of Britain, and believing in his pilots and fighting for their cause. And all the time through that, he was being undermined and threatened with retirement at the very point when the battle was at its highest. It's an amazing story. We owe so much to this incredible man and his foresight and his team and his ability to delegate and get these things done. Anyway, as I say, I'm not an expert in any of this, but I wanted to share these preparations with you and just get you thinking really about what happened 80 years ago. That's one lifetime in this modern age, one person's lifetime ago. And there are still people around who remember seeing those planes in the skies. We have a lot to thank that gentleman. Thank you so much for watching. I hope I've put this across easily. I've bound to have made some mistakes and what have you. It's a fascinating period of history for me. And so don't forget to follow, like and subscribe, become a patron. And I will be out and about doing my normal heritage, landscape and nature, of course, in the interim time. But every now and again, I will sit down and read a book and tell you more about it. There's another book here which I want to read, which is called Dowding and Headquarters Fighter Command, which talks all about Bentley Priory, about Dowding and their role. And I want to go and visit Bentley Priory, to the museum there, and bring you with me and maybe get some interviews with people who can tell me a bit more about it. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. I'm sorry I've gone on a bit. Bye for now.